Willkommen in einem anderen Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 30 of my game system design video series. This video is an attempt to analyse fire combat rules and determine some basic guidelines in their creation for use in micro armor figure gaming rules. This is my 7th update of this video, which includes corrected and updated content and improved images. If you have viewed this before, the changes are comparatively minor, but included lots of additional updated images and greater clarity on the concepts that I'm discussing, so I hope it would still be of some value. The objective of this video is to attempt to determine the optimum fire combat rules for use in micro armor figure gaming rules. This will be of general use to those considering designing their own rules, but others may find it useful in understanding why different rules use different types of fire combat rules, or for new players, what fire combat rules are supposed to represent, for example. The fire combat system is the sexy part of any sets of rules, and designers expend a great deal of effort in this area. There's a good reason for this, as poorly designed fire combat systems will doom a set of rules. Core Commander employed a very complex but complete fire combat system. However, its very complexity caused its downfall. To make matters worse, after a great deal of effort was expended in calculating the final die roll results, the results didn't really vary that much. The effort in throwing the dice, while important, was trivial compared with the effort in calculating the fire combat table rows to use. While an effective system, it was joyless. On the other hand, the fire combat system in LWRS, while involving the rolling of lots of dice, was simple to calculate it, and the dice rolls gave players a satisfying feeling that it mattered. From a probability point of view, it probably mattered as much as Core Commander, but it was easier to execute and gave the feeling of dramatic results. This had nothing to do with having an accurate fire combat system. Instead, it's all about playability and enjoyment. Most fire combat systems consist of a process to determine if a hit was made, and then a process to determine what the hit results in. In early game, this required a hit die roll and a penetrate die roll. In later games, this was called a hit and save die roll. Some game systems, such as Core Commander, attempted to merge everything into a single die roll, which seems like a good idea at the time, but actually had major issues, as we've discussed. Most hit attempts do not result in a hit. As a result, we should not need to do any further calculation after the hit failed. In Core Commander, you had to do all the calculations up front. Most of the calculations ended up not being of any value. Merging everything together means we have to do all the calculation required, even if the hit was not achieved. If the system was very simple, this is certainly tolerable, but otherwise is slowed down play unnecessarily, as occurs with Core Commander. Some squad scale rules use the concept of acquiring the target, and in some cases merging it with observation. This basically means fire combat only occurs if you can see the target sufficiently well to fire a weapon at it. This was one way of avoiding all the hit and post-hit complexity, which was required because at this scale those activities could be very complex. Most platoon and higher scale rules simply determine if the target was hit, assuming the target is visible. To hit a target, we need to consider factors such as distance, how large is the target, and the weapon being used. This, if done correctly, needs to be done using a simple process. As many cases of fire combat do not even result in a hit, there was no need to worry about the effects of the hit at this point. This was a way of avoiding post-hit complexity. It should be noted that when you fire at infantry, the concept of a hit includes shrapnel and lots of small arms fire. You are not hitting an infantry element, you are pumping a lot of fast-moving metal into the same space the infantry occupies in an attempt to cause casualties. Thus, in this case, a hit represents getting enough fast-moving metal into a location to have a physical effect. When we hit a target, we first need to determine if it's armoured or not. If armoured, we need to determine if the shell has penetrated the armour. This can be affected by range and involves subtracting the armour value from the shell penetration value at that range to arrive at a value which tells us if it penetrates or not. If unarmoured, the target is either a vehicle or troops. If it's a vehicle, it's the same as hitting an armoured target, except there is no armour to reduce the weapon's effect. If troops, we need to determine how much metal is flying around in that area, either shrapnel or bullets, to determine its impact. Hitting infantry or troops tends to involve a very different type of calculation for this reason. Thus, it's normally easier to destroy a truck than affect troops, even though most may be classed as a soft target. I've often noticed with rules that when rules provide an armour value, it's very close to the average armour thickness in centimetres. So tanks with a defensive effectiveness of 5 often have 50 mil of armour. I'm uncertain if this is a coincidence or not, but it does make it easy to determine armour values for your vehicles for many sets of rules. Rules such as FFT3 and Corps Commander go into even more detail. The thickness of armour is normally modified by its slope, and an average of turret, upper and lower armour is determined. This gives you a very accurate value, and if you have access to this kind of information, it gives you a very realistic outcome. Complexity is only an issue if the player has to deal with it. If the complexity is creating the equipment data charts, then that's acceptable, although it does put a lot of work on the game designer. Correspondingly, the gun's ability to penetrate armour values are often its ability to penetrate armour in centimetres. So a gun penetration value of 5 will often mean it can penetrate 5 centimetres or 50 mil of armour. The gun values will be affected by range. Corps Commander provides 8 different range values, which is probably overkill, but nonetheless, depending on the scale, it's something you need to factor in. Other rules give you only 2 ranges, which may be too few for platoon scale rules, but suitable for company scale rules. At squad scale, rules may allow players to fire different ammunition, which all have different effects. Armoured piercing capped, armoured piercing cap ballistic cap, armoured piercing ballistic cap, armoured piercing composite rigid, armoured piercing discarding sabot, high explosive squash head, high explosive anti-tank and high explosive. At platoon scale, the only ammunition normally considered is armoured piercing, heat and special ammunition such as APCR and APDS, or if we use the US nomenclature, HVAT. In the modern period, other options may also be available. Apart from heat and HE, the effect is to alter its armour penetration value. Heat ammunition works in a very different manner to kinetic rounds, so to reflect this you may need some special rules. Range has no effect on penetration. However, range is poor due to its low velocity. Often its accuracy is low due to its low velocity as well. Finally, spaced armour can reduce its effectiveness, while this type of armour has no special effect on kinetic rounds, for example. The final type of ammunition is high explosive. This can affect tanks, but it's normally used against foot or fortifications. Range has no effect on its impact, but can have an effect on its accuracy, once again due to the low velocity of the shells. The simplest system, while retaining reasonable detail, is one based on fire effectiveness and fire range. The fire range is basically the weapon's muzzle velocity, ranging from 500 meters per second to 1500 meters per second. For kinetic weapons, the fire effectiveness is halved for each multiple of the fire range. For non-kinetic weapons, it's reduced by 1 or not at all. This is only one example, and there are many other systems that you can consider. When you move to company or battalion scale, you would probably want to reduce complexity even further and only have 2 range bands, or even 1. At battalion scale, 1 range band is really all that's required. When firing at unarmoured vehicles, you can deal with it in the same manner as armoured vehicles, except there is no armour to worry about. Troops and gun crew on foot are a different matter. In many different sets of rules, elements have a different anti-tank and anti-infantry value, with the anti-infantry value being much lower. Spearhead uses the opposite system and gives troops on foot a defensive value of 5, while the lowest armoured vehicle has a value of 2. This means it's a lot easier to affect a low armoured vehicle than foot, which is probably correct. The ratio in Spearhead seems to match a number of other rules I've looked at, so probably represents some form of universal truth. When it comes to a basic system, I've travelled many different paths, but I've come to the conclusion the optimal system is one which involves minimal calculations, lots of die rolls, and the concept of save rolls. The reason why save rolls are useful is to do with modifiers. Rules which attempt to place everything into a single die roll normally have a long list of modifiers, but having a save throw allows you to split the modifiers into 2 smaller tables. The second table would only be referred to if a hit was achieved. The benefit of reducing the number of dice you throw is rarely worth the effort. The only exception is when fire combat is simplified to the point when the number of modifiers have been massively reduced. Many different sets of rules use a totally separate close combat system from the fire combat system for a host of reasons. The downside is players need to learn a new combat system. The upside is you can focus on only close assault factors in your combat system. I used to favour the separate system, but I've changed my mind after playing Lightning War Red Storm, which uses only one combined system for both fire combat and close combat, and it works reasonably well and only requires me to learn one different combat system. One way of simplifying rules is to ensure that players don't have to learn lots of different sorts of rules. So the advantage is that players only need to understand a single combat system if you merge fire combat with close combat or close assault, and this is a big advantage. It also forces the designer to create a combat system which is elegant, or to put it another way, which avoids unnecessary complexity, because it has to cater for these two very different things, and it needs to cater in a very atomic manner. Most of the discussion so far has been concerning direct fire, but indirect fire must also be catered for. A few game systems separate indirect fire and create a very different game system for it, such as FFT3. The better game systems merge it into the standard combat system. Once again, the advantage is you only need to know one different system. By creating a single fire combat system which can cater for all types of fire combats, the player does not need to learn a lot of different rules and game systems. They only need to look at the special rules which differentiate indirect fire from direct fire. Of course, the downside is that this adds a lot of complexity. On the other hand, the upside is the designers are forced into simplifying the system as much as possible, which I think overall has a much better result. Ground-to-air fire is rare, so having a totally different fire combat system is viable. But once again, if you can somehow use the same basic game system, it will speed up learning the game. This can be considered direct fire against an unarmoured target, or in some cases an armoured target. Air-to-ground fire is also rare, so having a totally different fire combat system is viable, but once again, if you can somehow use the same basic game system, it will speed up learning the rules. This could be considered a mix of indirect fire, such as with bombing, or direct fire, such as with strafing, or anti-tank guns on special tank-busting aircraft. Now we come to air-to-air combat. In my personal opinion, air-to-air combat should never occur. Designers can fudge this by just assuming some level of attrition when aircraft meet. But if you insist on having air-to-air combat, then using the same fire combat system is also highly recommended. Learning a new fire combat system for this really makes no game sense. Let's quickly look at terrain. As with observation, the simplest method of dealing with terrain is to look at the effects and then place those effects into a terrain effects chart. That way there is no need for special rules. An example is these four types: terrain which offers no protection, even if taking cover; terrain which only offers protection if taking cover; terrain which offers protection in all cases. The latter can offer more protection if you are also taking cover in it. For naming conventions, while it's easy to name featureless and standard terrain, I have no idea for the last category I've just discussed. Clutter is possibly acceptable, but it could cause problems with definition. I'm sure a game designer will come out with a good name. German word Schutzende for this terrain class may be suitable, but I suspect non-German speakers would find this not that something that rolls off the tongue, so to speak. This is an example terrain effects modifier chart for fire combat. I keep on repeating myself here, but as with my other presentations, the important thing is to keep it simple. The key area to focus on are those which are repeated a lot, and calculating fire combat die rolls is one of those aspects. Each modifier or calculation you remove or separate off into a lower frequency occurring area helps speed up gameplay. And so this concludes episode 30 of my presentation on micro armor game system design, in this case covering fire combat. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.